So I haven't watched the news over the last day, at least not the television news. I've seen updates on Facebook. At least 8 people have died so far in these uh, outbreaks of violence in the United States. Um, I won't talk too much about the specific details because, like I say, I haven't followed it closely. I'm not sure how all those individuals die. I understand some of them were in shootings. It may be that those deaths aren't actually directly connected to the riots. I mean, in a city like Chicago, which has a serious gang problem anyway, it might just be coincidental that a gang member got shot by another gang member. Who knows? I'm not going to comment in great detail about that, except that it's a serious situation. I think it's the worst, probably the worst collective urban violence in the United States, I think, since the Los Angeles riots in 1992. I can't think of anything that surpasses it. I mean, the Ferguson unrest was serious, the Charlottesville unrest was serious, the Baltimore unrest was serious, but I don't think any of it is as widespread as this. Um, Let me just get this out of the way before I continue. I absolutely think that there is no justification for looting or burning properties. I was misunderstood yesterday by one of my acquaintances online because he posted something that was sort of talking about how the protesters were being vilified, and he thought I was conflating legitimate protest with criticizing the rioting. But anyway, if you'd seen the context, it makes more sense than the way I'm describing it. But anyway, of course, there's legitimate protest to be had, and I think it would be very strange if there wasn't anger after what happened. But it is also very clear that there are anarchists taking advantage of this situation. Um, I wouldn't be at all surprised if the controversial group Black Bloc, which are actually not a ethnic black organization, they call themselves Black Bloc. They're mostly white anarchists. They dress all in black and they cause trouble wherever they go. Usually it's at anti-capitalist demos across the Western world, but they're nothing but hooligans. I have zero respect for them. Antifa has probably made a presence at these things, but there are also far-right neo-nationalist types who are probably making the presence felt. One such group is the so-called Boogaloo Boys, I believe they call themselves, which are an extreme far-right group that actually wants to reignite a second American Civil War. Um, that's the danger with this situation. There's extremes on both sides that are probably relishing this because they have vested interests in making the other side look bad. So, for example, if you get far right types, they can easily just frame it as black criminals causing mayhem. And if you get far left types, they could just pin it on Trump supporters. So I think it's probably both sides are doing this. I think there's extreme elements going on, and that's why the situation's got so bad because both sides are involved. Um, I think Trump's approach, as so often, has been weak. He hasn't made any sort of address to the nation to try and, as any good president would, to try and calm things down, to try and unify people, to try and get, to give some sort of message of statesmanship. He's utterly failed to do that. Um, and I think for politicians, they need to be quite careful about what they say here because they have to judge the mood of legitimate protesters and they have to judge the mood of anger against police brutality, but they also need to be careful not to look like they're encouraging violence. And a lot of politicians on the left are really going down the line of what Black Lives Matter wants to hear, rather than also tempering that with there is legitimate anger. It's, this cannot continue. We need to act on police brutality. There needs to be more accountability and justice, all of that. But they also need to temper it with, but I am not going to stand here and excuse looting and people being burned from their homes. I mean, that is also terrible. That is also terrible. Um, But anyway, there's one specific thing I want to address, and it's more from the right. Those who always seek to defend the police no matter what. Of course, each individual situation should be looked at in its own merits. I know not every case is exactly the same. I think that this case has most similarities with the Eric Garner case for obvious reasons. In both cases, you had men who were unarmed, black men who were unarmed, and who repeatedly said they couldn't breathe. Now, the apologists for the Eric Garner case say he had a pre-existing health condition. He was a big guy, he was overweight. But I have a big problem with this line of defense, and this is why. Um, when the independent autopsy shows up results, it may or may not show that Derek Chauvin having his knee on George Floyd's neck in this way was or was not the immediate cause of death. But I think common sense would indicate that the fact that it was prolonged, it was over 8 minutes, almost 9 minutes, and for at least two of those minutes, George Floyd was unconscious. Now, whatever angle you look at, apparently they're saying that he was resisting arrest. I mean, the apologists are saying this. This is a line they always use. That's another one I have a problem with, and I'll explain why in a minute. But on the health issue, let's say, for the sake of argument, George Floyd did have a pre-existing heart problem. I don't know if that's true or not, but I've heard that line used. Okay, well, put it this way. Let's say you have a heavy smoker and someone murders them by drowning them, by holding them underwater with force. Now, they might have weaker lungs than a regular person, so a regular person might be able to hold their breath longer. But the primary cause of death would still be physical act of someone else drowning them. So the fact that they have weak lungs might mean at some point they'll get lung cancer or maybe a heart attack. Another example I would use is if you get an overweight person, let's say they get armed intruders break into their house, and the shock and the fear of that incident gives them a heart attack in a way that it might not give to a slimmer person. Well, are you going to say, oh, well, they were overweight, so they were going to have a heart attack anyway? I think it's problematic as a form of defense. Now, you could say the burglars in that situation had no idea that their victim would be overweight or not, but when someone has a pre-existing condition, you can still have an extra factor that aggravates it. And if I was a prosecutor in the Derek Chauvin case, I would be wanting to know why he didn't ease the pressure when George Floyd was saying he couldn't breathe. Let's say that George Floyd was resisting arrest. It's a term I hate because I think very often it's misused. But anyway, let's say that he was. Okay, then Derek Chauvin could have replied, okay, I'm going to ease up, I'm going to let you up, but you need to comply. You're being arrested for being intoxicated or using the fraudulent card, whatever the allegations were. But the fact remains George Floyd was unarmed. So I don't know how anyone could claim that the police were acting in self-defense. This thing about resisting arrest, I honestly believe that there are some people out there who would actually interpret a suspect saying, why am I being arrested, as resisting arrest. And I'm not saying you don't get situations where suspects don't help matters by resisting arrest, by just being stubborn. But in this case, even if George Floyd was being a bit difficult, I don't know if he was or he wasn't. The fact is he was unarmed. So let's say he was maybe being verbally aggressive. And by the way, I don't think that's likely because if you look at the footage, what he was saying was, Officer, I can't breathe. Officer, that's a respectful term. He didn't come across as an aggressive person. So I'm more inclined to look at Derek Chauvin's past record. Apparently, a woman who knew both men, because she worked in a nightclub. I understand that George Floyd had worked as security there, and Derek Chauvin had been called there to disturbance, or he had also acted in some capacity. I don't know the precise details, but she said that he had a tendency to escalate things. So, for example, two patrons got into a fist fight. He would immediately want to use pepper spray, thus, impacting other patrons as well. And he seemed to be nervous and edgy around black men. Now, That should be quite important. I don't know if she'll be called to give testimony or not in terms of Derek Chauvin's character, but if she's telling the truth, that is important. Um, I just don't know how anyone could try to find any angle to justify this. And of course, Derek Chauvin shouldn't be tried by media. He should be given a fair trial. All the evidence and all the information needs to be available at that trial. But if he's exonerated, it will inflame anger because the lines of defense that might be used, I don't know if this will be a federal case or if it will be at state level, but pre-existing health conditions and resisting arrest, I think both arguments are quite weak because resisting arrest would only be a real problem if he was armed and posing a physical danger to the officers involved. Now, if he was unarmed, by definition, he can't be doing that unless he was throwing punches, and I haven't heard any reports that he was. Then the officers can't rationally claim that these are people in a very tough profession. I don't think they can claim that they felt their lives were threatened just because George Floyd happened to be physically quite big. He was 6'6" apparently. Um, I think it's a weak argument. It's the same with the Eric Garner case because he was a big man. I think the NYPD sort of used this resisting arrest argument in their favor to sort of say, oh, well, if, we were frightened because he was a big guy. Um, Basically, police apologists need to stop trying so hard every time. They always, always, always seek to try and find some angles to defend the police. Leave that to the defense team. Leave that to Derek Chauvin's lawyers. Okay, he's entitled to a legal defense. He's entitled to a fair trial. And I don't think he should be tried by media. I don't think, for example, it should be a case of feelings over facts. Of course not. But there are some facts, and one of them is that George Floyd was unarmed. Whatever way you look at it, that's irrefutable. So, I mean, I may be an outsider, but this has spread to the UK now. Black Lives Matter are now protesting in London. And whilst we don't have anywhere near the sort of racial tensions and police brutality issues as the United States has, or police force issues as the United States has, we're not totally devoid of it. People have died in police custody here, and there has been real tensions between the black community and particularly the Metropolitan Police. So it's not a totally alien thing from the UK, although I don't think that British police have anywhere near the sort of power that American police have. In fact, sometimes here they've got too little power. There was a case again in London where these teenage yobs were openly taunting an officer, and that speaks volumes. And he was on his own, and he couldn't do anything. He did call for backup, but that showed the sort of situation that it goes on here. So it might be a case of two extremes. It might be that American cops have way too much power, and British police don't have enough. But I think it does vary a lot, force to force, situation to situation. And there's certainly times that British police have also. I think a lot of right wing Americans think British police have no power whatsoever. It's not true. By the way, it's not true either that British police don't carry guns. They actually do. For example, anti-terrorism officers can carry guns, and I believe some units of the Metropolitan Police can carry guns. And I've seen police carry guns in Sunderland, which is a small city where I live. Not true that British police don't have guns. Um, and there have been examples of British police abusing their position. South Yorkshire has seemed to make a habit of it during this lockdown. So people just of course, it's important that people think with facts and not emotions, but you can't take away the emotional side of this because it is a very bad situation. But as for the looting and violence, that there's no rational argument to be made to justify that. I do not accept this idea of, let's say, black looters looting a business and then shouting out, "I can't breathe." They're using the death of George Floyd for their own selfish ends. And it's despicable actually. It's an insult to George Floyd's family.